I think the other thing, and we've talked about this already, but do not be afraid to fail. Just don't fail big.
Yes. Fail small.
Yeah. Fail small and often.
Yes.
Because we learn, and we do this at HLC a lot. We learn through those mistakes. Oh, okay. Well, we missed the mark on this, but remedying that is far easier if you're looking at it on a regular basis.
Welcome back to the Lessons for Tomorrow podcast, the motivational poster in your ear. I am your guest host, Landon DePasquale, Strategic Clients Director at AmericanEagle.com. In this episode, we're going to be diving into achieving organizational success through Agile principles and practices. I'm joined by our illustrious guest, Jon Davenport, CIO at Higher Learning Commission. Jon, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Landon. I'm excited to be here.
Jon, tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about HLC.
So I've been working in the technology industry since 1994, which gives you an idea of what color my hair is. And I'm the CIO at HLC. Higher Learning Commission is one of 6 former regional accreditors of higher education in the United States. We're now considered a national accreditor, and we provide a quality assurance and I would call it a pseudo-regulatory role in the higher education space.
Thank you for that kind of overview. So, Jon, I want to talk to you a little bit about Agile. This is actually a conversation we've had a couple times based on a talk that we gave actually at your conference. But I'd love to start by understanding a little bit about what is Agile.
Well, Agile is a philosophy and a set of tools and a collection of buzzwords. I think that the best way to think about Agile, though, is that it's an approach that you can take to the work that you do, both in personal and in business, to derive the greatest value and to ensure that you are remaining as flexible as possible as things change.
Yeah.
Time passes and the factors that you're dealing with will be different.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's a methodology for working, right? It's a way of thinking about how we work together.
Correct. And there's Agile organizational philosophies, theories that are really important in terms of being the guiding star, so to speak, for the work that you do. And I think most people, though, are familiar, at least in some respect, with the methodology, the tools, the concepts, the idea of Scrum or sprints, those words are certainly words that I hear a lot in the business sphere.
And so for folks who may have heard some of those words and maybe even have some idea of what Agile is, there's also some kind of pretty strong things that Agile is not.
Well, I think it's one of the things that people often get stuck on is that they think that Agile is only for project management. And I can tell you for sure that Agile tools and philosophies are highly important and useful in process management, not just for a start and end. I think a lot of people get stuck on the idea that if you're not following all of the rules set forth by a particular philosophy or methodology, that you are not doing Agile correctly. It's not purist, and I think that's something that people really need to remember. One of the things I also hear a lot is that, well, we're going to implement Agile and it's going to make us faster. Faster is not the goal. Efficient is the goal. Value-driven is the goal. Incremental changes are the goal. But speed is definitely not the goal, although a byproduct, ideally, of efficiency will be speed.
Yeah.
And it's not a weapon. And what I mean by that is that when you start to incorporate particular work styles, methods, and so forth, it is a temptation to turn to your fellows and say, you're not following the rules, you're not doing that right. And really, it's more of a framework where experimentation is celebrated along with the potential of failure that comes with that.
Absolutely.
I think Agile is really designed to make your failures small, though.
Yep.
And that's something that people need to think
and something
about.
You can learn from, too.
Right.
Hopefully not so disastrous that it just destroys the chains.
Correct. Yeah.
Positive.
And if you think about traditional project management techniques, like we call it waterfall, you find that a lot of projects will fail because the people who are working on those projects treat the plan as if it were scripture.
Yeah.
Rather than adapting to changes in the marketplace or, if you're building a bridge and you discover that half half the side of the other side of the bridge is going to be on sand. You're going to have to make some modifications to the way that you work. And so that sort of thing, when you're dealing with Agile, Agile allows you to do things in increments. And so consequently, your failures are smaller and less costly.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to make sure everyone listening to this knows Agile can only be used on technology projects, right?
Oh, 100% not. In fact, one of the things I think is true is that I think humans are actually wired for Agile approaches. I think that what Agile methodology, for example, the manifesto does, is it helps people frame that out, sort of a reflection of their own behavior, because I think most people actually understand that if they wake up in the morning and they've overslept, that they're going to have to adapt to that new circumstance and change whatever their approach is to achieve whatever their goal is, maybe in this case, getting to work on time.
Yeah.
I think people really are Agile, so helping them understand that the work that they're doing can be supported in that same way, while still being able to achieve goals that are defined on a large scale. You can look at a large project, for example, and say, I have these milestones that I have to meet. And those milestones may be really, really important and really, really stuck in terms of their set of requirements. But how you get to those milestones needs to be flexible.
Yeah. I think that's a key to Agile. And I think one of the things that you mentioned here is that focus on value. And I think a great thing about Agile is it allows you to adapt to what those valuable pieces are as you identify them.
I think that's correct. And I think, when we were implementing Agile at HLC, the IT team and the communication team, we approached that from the project management methodology perspective. And we had a lot of conversation about what tools would work, what tools wouldn't work. And we were really very agnostic about the types of methods that we were using, because every circumstance is different. You're not necessarily going to need the same tools when you're fixing your car that you do when you fix the sink.
Yep.
And so being able to have those conversations and see that manifest was really important. But when we got to the departments outside of that sphere, areas, working only on policy, they don't have any technology involved. Why would I want to use, what is that? How's that going to help?
Yeah.
And being able to have them understand that they have to move to a stakeholder first philosophy, and that they need to be able to understand what their increments are going to be, while also understanding that they can make rapid changes based on the feedback and what they learn at each interval's endpoint, has been a really strong emphasis for us. And I think that the best way to teach people is through metaphor.
I think that's fantastic. We've talked a little bit about what Agile is, but tell me a little bit more about the methodology around Agile and kind of how you do it.
So let's look at project management as the frame to look at first, because I think that's where most people think of Agile when they're hearing those words. So we have a number of projects that we're running all the time, and they have really key critical milestones that we've determined.
Yeah.
But how that work gets done is in very small increments. We, in Agile, you call them sprints. We use a combination of Scrum, which is a very well-defined, structured approach to Agile with a lot of tools and terminology embedded in it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the Scrum elements that we're dealing with at HLC are those that involve the sprint, which is an interval of time during which work is performed, the sprint review, during which stakeholders have an opportunity to see and talk about that work and provide feedback to the team that's doing it. We have adopted the product owner concept. Everybody in the organization who is working on something ultimately has some ownership over their projects, but there's ultimately one person who's the primary stakeholder. So if you think about it in terms of software, we have a vice president who is the primary stakeholder or the product owner. But if we talk about policy, well, that too has a primary stakeholder, our president.
Yep.
And so we have folks sort of take on these roles and understand what they are. And then we provide facilitation. And in Agile, you talk about that like their Scrum Master. But, we've translated that in our organization to just facilitation really is what we look at. And we use Kanban, which is a method of organizing work. I think that the original analogy was that it was like if you took a bunch of Post-it notes and put them into columns on a whiteboard, and you can move those Post-it notes over time. So we look at work in that way. We use that for both projects with a terminal end and also for managing processes. And surprisingly, like I said earlier, process management really is well tuned with Kanban because it's repetitive and you want to be able to see where things are and you want to be able to see things flow from the beginning to the end of that process. I hope that's helpful.
It is. And I think it's a great example because Kanban is one way of doing Agile, but it's not the only way, right?
Correct.
There's so many different other flavors of doing Agile. You mentioned Scrum. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it, and Kanban is what has worked for you guys, but it's not the only way.
And we also use a parking lot model. And how you translate that parking lot, you can move that into a Kanban space, or you can move that into a sprint backlog, or you could measure that any number of different ways. And ultimately, you're still collecting work that needs to be done, prioritizing that work with the stakeholders, and parceling it out to the team that has to deliver it in ways that they can look at that work in discrete chunks. And that gives us the opportunity to pull the brakes if we have to, if we're going the wrong direction, and reevaluate.
Yeah. You also mentioned tools. I think there's a misunderstanding that Agile is primarily defined by the tools that you use. And this brought up, I think, a really funny interaction that you and I had when we were first putting this talk together. One of the pieces that we mentioned, we were talking about different tools and how they're different tools for the job, and some tools are better than others. And I said, yeah, that's great. You can use just about anything for Agile, but like, don't try and use Excel to do Agile. And you said, no, we actually use Excel.
We do.
So tell me, first of all, why tool agnosticism is really important, then tell me your Excel story.
Well, let's talk about first, tool agnosticism is important because every organization is going to have different budget, different access to different tools, and different people, different wiring of people. And across an organization, you may have people who have different areas of strengths, different familiarities with tools. There are tons of project management tools out there. Monday.com, you've got a billion of them. Not all of them are great in the sense that all of them can facilitate this work. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're organizing information in a way that is consumable and shareable. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons we use Excel, especially for tracking parking lot items and a good portion of the requirements that we gather, is because everybody in the organization is familiar enough with an Excel spreadsheet. They don't have to go learn a new system or a new set of terminology. It's easy to share. They can update it. It makes the process of communicating and coordinating with different areas far more streamlined. And so, that's why we use Excel. We use it for a variety of different purposes. We also then will take that, like another tool that we use, not that I'm necessarily endorsing it, but we do use it, is Microsoft Planner, which comes with bundled with our Office 365 licenses, which means that every one of our staff members has access to it. Our HR department recently took all of their onboarding and offboarding processes, including all of the other departments that have to be part of that, and built out a planner tool that they can reuse every time we have to onboard or offboard. And it's like, in some ways it's just a massive checklist, but in another way, you can see who's assigned to what portion of it. You can see where you are in the flow of time with it. So using Planner as a Kanban board for that purpose has proven to be very successful for people who are really not technically focused. So
that's an awesome example. I know we've talked a lot about the Agile methodology, but there's also this concept of being an Agile organization. And in some ways, that's almost more important. Tell me a little bit about what you've seen at HLC with that.
Well, I believe that it's very easy. IT at HLC operated using Agile tools and methodologies for several years before anybody outside of the department even noticed, which is fine. But for an organization to take that on and apply it beyond just the scope of technical projects and really understand how it fits into modeling and developing and successfully delivering major projects. You have to have an organizational buy-in. The leadership has to empower every team in the organization, both through repeated reinforcement of these ideals, because at the end of the day, and I think we've said this already, but I want to emphasize it, Agile itself is a value proposition. It's a question of what is the work that we're doing producing the value that we expect? And if not,
what do we need to change to get to that value?
Right. And it gives you the room to change to get to that value, because you're never going very far before you pause and look back and say, what did we do and what worked? And a term for that in Agile is retrospective, but you could call it post-mortem. You could call it anything you want.
After action report.
Well, I love that one, after action report. But you have to have that built into the, I don't know if the word is the correct word, ethos of the organization, the philosophies of the organization has to buy into that idea. And so management really has to empower staff through that. They also have to really stand back and let staff do self-organization. One of the principal ideas of Agile is that teams are self-organized. And everybody goes, well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that you don't have to go through 13 layers of red tape to get assistance from somebody who has the expertise that you need at the moment that you need it. And so when you're building out the idea of Agile in an organization, understanding and empowering teams to be cross-functional, to talk to each other, to have those interactions is a really critical component. And then if you don't have goals for your organization that everyone understands, you're kind of in trouble, right? Because again, if you're focused on value and you think value for the work you're doing is X and I think it's Y, we have a problem. It's a disconnect. So leadership really needs to be really clear. And HLC is great at that. We are all participating in the strategic planning, which occurs on every 3 to 5 year basis. So staff have a voice in that. But more importantly, staff are educated in it. What is it that we're doing? And I think one thing too, I just wanted to also focus on is that, again, not every organization is going to have a big budget, but having access to tools, having access to training, those are really important. And one of the things we did at HLC is we got every staff person training in the fundamentals of Agile. Just what are the concepts? What are the different methodologies? What are the values that they want to instill? And what can we take away from that? And so that allows us to have a common nomenclature and to have conversations around orienting in the right direction being the direction that the organization wants to go.
No, that makes total sense. I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience with Agile at HLC specifically.
Oh, well, there's so many things. So I have a PMP, and my background is very much in technology, but I have been doing project management and technology for longer than I can actually recall at this point. And at HLC, when we started to look at some of our projects, they're very large. They can span several years. And there's a big risk in those projects because if you kick a project off and then kind of just hope that it's going along nicely, you may find yourself 6 months into it with totally the wrong product. So I think that probably the one of the key examples is that the communications team came to me and said, we want to build a whole new website. We want to get rid of the old website. We're going to redo the content. We want a new user interface. What's the best approach? And so we sat down and we agreed that really the very first step was to take the Agile concept of personas and start to think about what individuals are in our audience. And so by naming those individuals, we identified that state and federal agencies are a stakeholder. Parents and students are stakeholders. Our peer reviewers who are our volunteers are stakeholders. Our institutions who need to know our policies are our stakeholders. But additionally, our internal staff are stakeholders. And hackers are stakeholders. And so segmenting that out allowed us to bring in other areas and get their input as to like the content and the flow. And so when we ultimately built and delivered that website, that's just a small component of it. But we were able to really orient everything that we did around the value to those stakeholders. And it enabled us to spend our money wisely. So another concept in Agile is that you're doing things incrementally. And if you have a budget and your budget says you can spend X and you start to be pushing that edge, one of the things you need to be able to do is evaluate, well, what are my priorities? What's my, as they say, the minimum viable product? What are the key elements that cannot be missing? And then you can go back and you can say, well, this part we can do in phase 2, the forever pending
Future
phase 2. But that in and of itself, I think, is a strength, because you can communicate that out to stakeholders too. You can say, yeah, we heard that, and that was important, but not as important as this.
I think what's also really interesting is when we gave this talk at your event, we heard from your members about how they've utilized Agile as well. That was really incredible to me.
Yeah, there was a woman there who had been thrust into the role of handling the accreditation renewal process at her institution, and with very little resources. And what she ended up doing, I think in some ways, going back to that idea that humans are inherently agile, she intuited a lot of these elements. And she gave a presentation at the conference too, which I thought was great. But she ended up really piecing together these ideas of incremental work, constant review, interaction with stakeholders, focus on value, and a couple of other change management concepts like regular communication to all of the folks who might have an interest in it. And it was exciting to see that, and to see her aha moment when she realized that she didn't have to be a scrum master. She just had to understand some of the key concepts, and she could pick and choose. And we also had a woman come up to us and say, I've been doing project management for 25 years, and it never occurred to me you could use Kanban to manage processes. And I thought that was great, not because I feel kind of bad that people don't think about it that way, but I felt great that she could see that. She had that aha moment, because I think one of the things people get caught up in is the language and the doctrine.
Yeah.
They really feel like, well, I have to follow these steps. And I'm not dismissing the steps. They can be important. But the question is, how do you discern what is important for what you're doing?
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest barriers to people adopting Agile or doing Agile are precisely those people that come and go, nope, you're not doing it right, or you have to do it this way. And what they end up doing is missing the whole concept that at the core of Agile is doing what makes the most sense in your circumstance based on your information, and then modifying based on the feedback you get, as opposed to going, nope, these are the 10 rules that you have to follow, and you always follow those 10 rules. It's almost like doing Agile from a waterfall perspective.
Well, that's a great way of putting it. I had a vice president come to me. She gave me like a 10-page document. She said, this is how we're going to approach Agile in my department. And she's brilliant, and she had done some amazing things with this, but what she had actually constructed was a template to run a department as if it were an Agile project. And so we worked on that together, and we were able to unbundle those ideas.
Yeah.
Her department is not an Agile project.
Nope.
You can't run it that way, but they can approach their work with informed by certain ideas. The other thing that we did, because we ran into a lot of challenges with a lot of the non-technical folks, and these are brilliant people with doctorate degrees, people who've been working in higher ed for years and years. But they really struggled with this because they thought, well, I don't have 10-minute sprint. I don't have 10-minute stand-ups every day. What does that mean? That's an Agile concept, where you are meeting with your team to talk about what's going well and what isn't. But what we actually did, we used a bottle exercise, and that exercise, just to summarize real quick, it's not easy to visualize, but you give a bottle to one person and they have to take that bottle to the other side of the room, and everybody in the room has to touch it on its way. And you do that exercise 3 times, and you let the group adapt. So the first time around, they were horribly inefficient and confused. The second time, they were inefficient but not as confused. And by the third time, they had cut the time to deliver that water bottle by over 80%. And that's when a whole bunch of folks suddenly went, oh,
that's what this is.
Oh, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we have to talk always, we have to think about what are the best metaphors or analogies to help people wrap their minds around this.
Yeah.
Because the tools are powerful.
Absolutely. So Jon, as our kind of final question, how would someone listening to this implement Agile where they are? Like what's the takeaway, or what's the thing that they do when they go back to their org, go back home, go back to their school, and they want to implement Agile? What do you think those steps look like for them?
Well, I think there's several that we implemented that I would recommend. One I mentioned earlier is just training.
Yeah.
Getting people familiar, because understanding the terminology and adopting that helps you really communicate complex ideas in a short period of time to your fellow peers, people you're working with. The other thing is establish a champion team internally. It doesn't have to be big. It should definitely not be only IT people. You need people from a couple of different areas in the organization who have a viewpoint where they can hear that people are being challenged and provide assistance in that context, and have that champions team work with leadership to identify goals that they want to achieve and then help make that happen. So like we used our champions team to take the Agile manifesto and translate it into our context. So every sacred word in the manifesto, every concept in the manifesto has been translated to HLC speak. Because looking at the manifesto itself, it doesn't do that automatically.
Yeah.
And that really helped people. We also posted a number of Agile, like the gamification is a concept in Agile where you make decisions and prioritize work through gamification. And so we gave a lot of examples of that on our intranet to staff to say, hey, this is a way you can experiment when you're working with your own team and just play with these ideas, see how they work for you. The other thing is choose a small project or task and iterate it. Break it down into smaller chunks. Don't do everything all at once. Make sure you have stakeholder involvement, and make sure you're doing retrospectives at the end of the day, because that really, I think, is one of the most critical aspects of it, even though it's kind of buried at the end. Without that retrospective, you don't learn anything. So, and then the other thing I think is that commit to a high level of communication. One of the really key elements in delivering work successfully, regardless of what methods you're using, is regular and ongoing communication. The time of the black box is gone.
Yeah.
Organizations cannot afford that. You wouldn't do that if you were planning a vacation at home. You wouldn't go plan 90% of the vacation, then turn to your spouse and say, okay, we're going on vacation. I mean, maybe you would, but I couldn't get away with that. I would probably miss the boat on a lot of things that my spouse would have a stake in. And so involving your stakeholders and communicating with them on a regular basis is really important. And remember that you can't do everything all at once.
Yeah, you got to chunk it up into little pieces. I think my biggest takeaway, having worked in Agile for a little while, has been that high communication and a focus on value, right? I think those pieces are key. And if I were to encapsulate or distill down the essence of it, it's high communication around items of value to ensure that whatever your next increment is that you're taking on, you're focusing it on that highest value that you can get.
Absolutely. And prioritizing the work around that.
Yes.
That's what you're saying, and I agree. I think the other thing, and we've talked about this already, but do not be afraid to fail. Just don't fail big.
Yes. Fail small.
Yeah. Fail small and often.
Yes.
Because we learn, and we do this at HLC a lot. We learn through those mistakes. Oh, okay. Well, we missed the mark on this, but remedying that is far easier if you're looking at it on a regular basis.
Awesome. Jon, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time and being willing to talk to us about Agile.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to the Lessons for Tomorrow podcast. Find out more about AmericanEagle.com's services and today's topic in the description below. Like, comment, and subscribe, and share this episode with others. As always, I am your guest host, Landon DePasquale, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.